President-elect Trump proposed sweeping reform to the nation's education system during his campaign. ABC's Mary Alice Parks has been tracking that for us and joins us now. Mary Alice, I know it's one of the issues you've been looking at. What did Trump say about education policy while on the campaign trail?
Well, I think it's important to remember, Phil, that the majority of education policy and funding is decided on the state and even local city county level. But parents' sort of grievance and frustration about the classroom, sort of culture wars that have erupted around the classrooms, really sort of took on a national prominence. And we saw Trump and other Republicans in particular running on a national level sort of tap into some of that frustration and talk about it. A little bit of a mixed bag from President-elect Trump. On the one hand, he talked about wanting to eliminate the Department of Education. On the other hand, he also talked about wanting to actually use the federal government to punish or restrict funding to school districts and states that might not make the curriculum reforms that he or other Republicans thought were important. So sort of a split philosophy about whether you are trying to decentralize education more to the states or actually centralize and federalize education curriculum standards. Look, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of Republican states passing new strict education laws, changing curriculum and how teachers can talk about race and gender in the classroom. We've also seen for President Trump, President-elect Trump, spending a lot of time on the campaign trail with the Moms for Liberty group, sort of a far-right, more conservative group that has been a big part of pushing some of those book ban proposals, trying to get books, specifically books that mention race or gender identity, out of school libraries, Phil.
And of course, what happens on the campaign trail and once someone gets to the White House can be different. We don't know what a Trump administration would do as of yet, but how much of this could be done by executive order, which the president-elect may not even need because he may have the House and the Senate anyways, but how much of this can be done by executive order?
Yeah, probably not a lot. Look, it would help Republicans a whole lot if they do, in fact, keep control of the House. Their chances there are looking pretty good, and it does make it a lot easier for President-elect Trump to do, to sort of put his own plans, his own priorities in place if he has full control and unified government under the Republican Party. If they control both the Senate and the House and the White House, they can just do a lot more, move a lot faster. Things like huge changes to the Department of Education, or if he really was going to try to move to scrap the department altogether, that would take congressional approval. Another interesting question is whether they would try to set up a national school voucher style system. We've seen that as a popular move in some Republican states. Interesting, a lot of voters actually knock down these proposals, but we've seen Republican governors try to put them in place where basically a taxpayer can sort of take a voucher of their sort of what would be their tax sort of payer dollars and use it towards a private school, religious school, homeschooling if they choose to keep their kid out of public school. Critics say that it could gut public education. It's controversial for sure, but there's definitely been a question about whether Republicans in Capitol Hill, if they do have unified government, would try to put any sort of national program like that in place.
All right, Mary Alice Parks. Mary Alice, thanks so much. For more on what Trump's Agenda 47 campaign policies could mean for students and parents, I'm joined now by Jon Valant. He is director of the Brown Center on Education Policy at the Brookings Institute. Jon, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us. I'm wondering how much of education is handled at the local level. Families might be surprised to figure that out. Some families may not be aware of which programs are supported from the federal level. If a Trump administration did something like eliminate the Department of Education, what would that mean for students?
It's a good question. And so for the most part, education is run at the local and state levels. So there are some constraints on what the federal government can do that come just by virtue of states really are making a lot of decisions. So some of the things that the Trump administration could not do, for example, we won't all of a sudden see a national curriculum. We won't see teacher hiring somehow happening from the federal level. And really the sort of day-to-day management of schools is really not under the control of the federal government. Now, that being said, the federal government they have some really important roles to play when it comes to education. One of which, and one that the Trump administration could do a lot just on its own, has to do with federal civil rights enforcement in schools. So we would be very likely to see probably pretty early in the Trump administration, for example, that they would rescind some rules from the Biden administration that granted some protections to LGBTQ plus students. And you'll see a lot of that kind of work. And then there is, as you said, this push to potentially try to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education, but that too seems very difficult, at least at this point.
Trump has backed a program that would allow students' allotment of public education funds to be transferred to non-public schooling options. But voters in 3 states just rejected efforts to codify or expand similar programs. So tell us what happens with that.
So for a long time, the Republican Party has pushed different types of school choice policies that essentially give families public money to pay for private school tuition. And what we've been seeing across the country is that, interestingly, they're actually running into a lot of opposition from Republicans in rural areas who worry about what the impact of those programs might be on these rural schools that are in places that don't have the population density to have a whole lot of school options, and worry about potentially the loss in funding that would come from having those types of programs. So what we've seen is there are a handful of states, almost all of them really red states, that have passed these kind of state-level private school voucher programs. The most recent states that voted on it just this week, all 3 of them, as you said, voted against those programs. And it may be that we see the Trump administration try its hand at creating some federal school choice policy, but they actually tried that a bit in the first Trump administration, and there too ran into some opposition, even from members of their own congressional delegation.
Yeah, some anxiety in the education sector. We will see how it moves forward. Jon Valant, thank you so much.
Thanks, Phil.